You're a medieval doctor, and a patient comes to you with a toothache. Your solution: tie a string around the infected tooth, attach the other end to a slamming door, and literally yank the tooth out of their skull, while they're fully conscious, screaming in agony. But here's the twist: that's actually considered advanced medical care for the time period, because at least you're not prescribing them to drink mercury or eat crushed emeralds. Welcome to the most revolting era of human history. We're not here to celebrate medieval achievements or romanticize knights and castles, but to explore the absolutely disgusting daily habits of people living through what we call the Dark Ages. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle for that authentic medieval ambience, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the grime, sweat, and questionable life choices of our ancestors. When we think of medieval hygiene, most of us imagine dirty peasants rolling around in mud, but the reality was far more complex and infinitely more disgusting than simple dirt. The medieval relationship with cleanliness wasn't just about being lazy or ignorant. It was a carefully constructed philosophy that viewed water and bathing as genuinely dangerous to human health. Picture this: you're living in 12th century Europe, and your local priest has just finished a sermon explaining that excessive bathing opens the pores, allowing evil spirits and disease to enter your body. The church taught that spiritual cleanliness was infinitely more important than physical cleanliness. In fact, being too clean was seen as vanity, a sin that could damn your soul forever. So naturally, people avoided water like it carried the plague, which ironically it sometimes did. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Medieval people weren't completely oblivious to hygiene, they just had their own twisted logic about peat. Instead of bathing, they practiced what was called dry cleaning. No, not the kind you take your suits to. They would scrape dirt and dead skin off their bodies with crude metal tools called strigils, borrowed from ancient Roman practices. Then they'd rub themselves down with linen cloths soaked in wine vinegar, or sometimes just spit. The wealthy had slightly better options. They could afford to change their undergarments more frequently, usually linen shirts that absorbed sweat and oils. The theory was that clean linen next to the skin would draw out impurities like a medieval paper towel. But even the rich rarely bathed more than a few times per year, and when they did, it was often a communal affair, entire families sharing the same bathwater, in order of importance: father first, then mother, then children. By the time the baby got in, the water was so murky you could lose a small child in it. Hair care was particularly revolting, since washing hair was considered especially dangerous. People would go months, even years, without cleaning their scalps. Instead, they'd comb through their hair with fine-tooth combs, trying to remove lice, fleas, and the chunks of food that inevitably got tangled in there during messy medieval meals. When their hair became too matted and disgusting, even by medieval standards, they'd simply cut it off and start over. Women had an additional challenge, since long hair was considered a sign of virtue and femininity. They couldn't just hack it off when it became unbearable. Instead, they developed elaborate headdresses and veils that covered their unwashed locks. These coverings served a dual purpose: hiding the revolting state of their hair, while also trapping all the smells, creating a personal aromatic cloud that followed them wherever they went. The smell must have been indescribable. Imagine the concentrated essence of months of unwashed human, mixed with whatever herbs or perfumes they used to mask the odor. Wealthy women would stuff their clothing with dried flowers, lavender, rose petals, or mint. But underneath that floral facade was layers upon layers of human funk that would make a modern garbage dump seem fragrant by comparison. Teeth were another frontier of horror. Since sugar was rare, tooth decay wasn't as common as you might expect. But that doesn't mean medieval mouths were pleasant places to visit. People cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with rough cloth, sometimes dipped in salt or honey, but more often they just chewed on twigs or used their fingernails to scrape away food particles. Bad breath was so common that it wasn't really remarked upon unless it was exceptionally foul, which tells you something about the baseline level of mouth horror. People were working with breath fresheners, included chewing on herbs like mint or parsley, but also more questionable substances like animal dung mixed with honey, because apparently medieval people thought the solution to smelling like crap was to literally eat crap. Personal grooming tools were crude and often shared. Entire families might have one metal comb, which would be passed around, gathering everyone's head lice and scalp. Diseases along the way. Razors, when they existed, were basically sharp pieces of metal that left faces looking like they'd survived a small war. Shaving was often done without any lubricant, just dry scraping that left skin raw and infected. The concept of deodorant was completely foreign. People simply accepted that humans smell terrible and built their social lives around this assumption. Important meetings were often conducted outdoors, not for fresh air, but because indoor spaces became unbearably funky when multiple unwashed bodies gathered together. Churches were notorious for their overwhelming human stench, especially during winter when windows remained closed for months. Perhaps most disturbing was the medieval approach to feminine hygiene. Women's monthly cycles were viewed as spiritually unclean, requiring isolation and purification rituals, but the practical management was left entirely to improvisation. Rags were reused without proper cleaning, creating perfect breeding grounds for infection and disease. Women were often banned from preparing food, touching religious items, or even entering churches during their periods, not just for spiritual reasons, but because the smell was considered offensive to God himself. Medieval people did recognize that some level of cleanliness was necessary for health, but their methods were often worse than doing nothing at all. Public bathhouses existed in some cities, but they were breeding grounds for disease, where the same water was shared by dozens of people throughout the day. These bathhouses were often associated with prostitution, not just because of loose morals, but because they were genuinely the only places where people got naked together. The irony is that medieval people were often obsessed with purity and cleanliness, just not the physical kind. They spent hours on spiritual cleansing through prayer, fasting, and confession, while completely ignoring the fact that their bodies were walking biological disasters. This disconnect between spiritual and physical cleanliness created a society where someone could be considered holy and pure, while literally rotting from the inside out. Clothing was rarely washed, since soap was expensive and the process was labor-intensive. People would wear the same garments for months until they literally fell apart. Then they'd patch them up and keep wearing them. The wealthy might have multiple sets of clothes, but even they would wear each outfit for weeks before changing. The smell of old sweat, urine, and food stains became so ingrained in fabric that even when clothes were eventually washed, they never truly came clean. Skin diseases were rampant and often went untreated because they weren't considered serious health issues, as long as you weren't dying from them. People lived with chronic rashes, boils, and infections that would send a modern person screaming to the emergency room. Medieval doctors often attributed these conditions to spiritual failings rather than poor hygiene, so the cure was more prayer, not more soap. The wealthy sometimes attempted to mask their body odor with expensive perfumes, but these were often so overpowering that they created their own assault on the senses. Imagine walking into a cloud of rose water, so thick it makes your eyes water, only to realize it's desperately trying to cover the smell of someone who hasn't bathed since the previous season. These perfume clouds became mobile markers of wealth and status, but also dead giveaways that someone was hiding something truly horrific underneath. Children were considered naturally dirty and were often left unwashed for even longer periods than adults, since they were thought to be closer to animals than civilized humans. Babies might go weeks without being cleaned, beyond having their faces wiped with whatever cloth was handy. Older children were expected to eventually learn hygiene habits, but with no good examples to follow, they simply perpetuated the cycle of filth. Even the clergy, who preached about the spiritual dangers of excessive bathing, were not exempt from the physical realities of medieval hygiene. Monasteries and convents developed their own approaches to cleanliness, often slightly better than the general population, but still horrifying by modern standards. Monks might bathe a few times per year during religious festivals, but they also practiced extreme fasting and physical mortification that left them weak, diseased, and incredibly fragrant. Pontoff. Hygiene were attributed to supernatural causes, evil humors, bad air, or divine punishment, rather than the obvious fact that people were living in their own filth. Doctors prescribed bloodletting prayer and herbal remedies, while completely ignoring the possibility that maybe, just maybe, washing once in a while might help. Perhaps most telling is that medieval people developed an entire vocabulary around different types of human smells. There were specific words for the funk of unwashed hair, the stench of old sweat, the reek of infected wounds, and the particular odor that came from wearing the same clothes for months. This linguistic sophistication around body odor tells us that not only were people incredibly smelly, but they were also acutely aware of just how bad they smelled. The gap between medieval and modern hygiene standards is so vast that a time traveler from our era would probably faint from the assault on their senses within minutes of arriving in a medieval town. The combination of unwashed bodies, rotting food and human waste created an olfactory landscape that would challenge even the strongest stomach yet. Somehow millions of people lived their entire lives in this aromatic nightmare, considering it completely normal. If medieval hygiene was bad, their bathroom habits were an entirely different circle of hell. The concept of privacy when relieving oneself was essentially non-existent, and the methods people used to deal with human waste were so revolting that they make modern porta potties seem like luxury spas. Let's start with the most basic question. Where did people go to the bathroom in medieval times? The answer is everywhere and anywhere. The idea that human waste needed to be contained or disposed of in sanitary ways was about as foreign as the concept of flying cars. Most people simply stepped outside their homes, lifted their robes or tunics, and relieved themselves wherever convenient: the back garden, the side of the house, the street if necessary. It was all fair game. Cities were particularly nightmarish, because with thousands of people all following this same approach, the streets became open sewers. People would throw their chamber pot contents directly out of their windows, often shouting "Gardez-le," a corruption of the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, as a warning to pedestrians below. Imagine walking through a medieval city and having to constantly dodge flying human waste while trying to avoid stepping in the layers of filth already coating the streets. The wealthy had slightly better arrangements in the form of garde-robes, essentially holes cut into the walls or floors of castles that dropped waste into moats or pits below. But even these primitive toilets were shared by multiple people and rarely cleaned. The smell was so overwhelming that garde-robes were often built in towers or separate buildings to keep the stench away from living quarters, though the wind would frequently blow the aroma back toward the main castle. Castles built over water had the luxury of letting their waste drop directly into rivers or moats, which seems convenient until you realize that these same water sources were often used for drinking, cooking, and bathing. Downstream communities essentially lived off the filtered waste of their upstream neighbors, creating a cascade of disease and contamination that flowed along every major waterway. Privacy was non-existent. Even among the wealthy group, latrines were common, where multiple people would sit side by side on wooden benches with holes cut out, conducting their business while carrying on conversations about politics, weather, or local gossip. Imagine trying to negotiate a peace treaty or discuss your daughter's marriage prospects while you and your fellow negotiators are all relieving yourselves together. It adds a whole new dimension to diplomatic relations. Toilet paper didn't exist, so people had to improvise with whatever was available. The wealthy might use soft cloth or wool, but most people made do with leaves, sticks, stones, or simply their hands. Moss was considered a luxury item for bathroom use, and people would actually compete to find the softest varieties during certain seasons. When preferred wiping materials were scarce, people would stockpile them like precious commodities. Communal toilet facilities in monasteries and public buildings were breeding grounds for disease, where dozens of people shared the same wooden seats. These seats were rarely cleaned and never disinfected, so every use added another layer of contamination. Sitting on a public toilet in medieval times was like playing biological roulette. You never knew what diseases you might contract from the person who used it before you. Chamber pots were common in homes, but their contents had to go somewhere. Most people simply emptied them out the nearest window or door without any consideration for where the waste would end up. Servants whose job it was to empty chamber pots often developed chronic respiratory problems from constantly breathing in the fumes. They also frequently suffered from skin diseases and infections from handling contaminated waste without any protective equipment. The smell of human waste was so pervasive in medieval settlements that people developed a tolerance for odors that would make a modern person violently ill. Visitors from other regions often commented on the overwhelming stench of cities and towns, but locals seemed genuinely unaware of how bad their communities smelled because they had lived with it their entire lives. Children learned bathroom habits by observing adults, which meant that generation after generation grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to relieve themselves in public spaces or share toilet facilities with dozens of other people. Potty training consisted mainly of teaching children to step outside or use a designated corner of the house. There was no concept of hygiene or privacy, being important for psychological development. Women faced additional challenges during menstruation. Since there were no sanitary products available, they had to improvise with rags, cloth, or even moss. These materials were often reused without proper cleaning, creating perfect conditions for infections and diseases. Women were also frequently banned from using certain toilet facilities during their periods because their monthly cycles were considered spiritually contaminating. The wealthy sometimes had servants whose entire job was managing waste disposal. These servants often lived shorter lives than other household staff due to constant exposure to disease and contamination. They would empty chamber pots, clean guardrobe pits, and dispose of waste, often without any protective equipment. Their position in the household hierarchy was barely above animals, which tells you something about how waste management was viewed. Medical understanding of waste-related diseases was practically non-existent. Doctors attributed illnesses caused by poor sanitation to supernatural causes, bad air or divine punishment, rather than the obvious connection to human waste. They prescribed bloodletting prayer and herbal remedies, while completely ignoring basic sanitation that could have prevented most of these problems. Public latrines in cities were often built over streams or rivers that flowed through town. These streams would carry waste from one neighborhood to another, spreading disease throughout the entire community. People downstream had no choice but to live with the waste of those upstream, creating a hierarchy of contamination that followed the flow of water. Winter presented special challenges since outdoor relief was less comfortable. People would often hold waste longer than healthy, leading to constipation and other digestive problems. They would also designate indoor areas for emergency use, which meant that homes became even more contaminated during cold months. The smell inside medieval homes during winter must have been absolutely unbearable. Trombodenzid. Rural areas had slightly better arrangements since waste could be spread over larger areas and used as fertilizer, but even farmers often contaminated their own water sources by relieving themselves too close to wells or streams. The concept of maintaining distance between waste and water was understood by some, but not consistently practiced. Traveling presented unique challenges since there were no roadside facilities. Pilgrims, merchants, and other travelers had to relieve themselves wherever they could find privacy, which was usually nowhere. Long journeys became exercises in biological endurance as people tried to time their bathroom needs with appropriate stopping points. The wealthy sometimes employed servants called grooms of the stool, whose job was to assist with royal bathroom needs. These servants were actually considered prestigious positions because they had intimate access to royalty. But imagine having a job that literally involved wiping the king's bottom and being grateful for the opportunity because it meant social advancement. Disease transmission through poor waste management was rampant, but medieval people had no understanding of germs or bacteria. They lived in a world where cholera, dysentery, typhoid regularly swept through communities, killing thousands. But they attributed these outbreaks to divine wrath or astrological influences rather than the obvious fact that everyone was living in contaminated filth. Even religious institutions struggled with waste management. Monasteries and convents had communal latrines that served dozens of people. These facilities were often built over streams or pits, but were rarely maintained properly. The irony of holy people living in such unholy conditions was apparently lost on medieval society. The lack of proper waste disposal created a feedback loop where communities became increasingly contaminated over time. Streets would build up layers of waste that would be packed down by foot traffic, creating permanent foundations of human filth. Buildings were literally constructed on compressed waste, and the archaeological record shows that medieval settlements were built on centuries of accumulated human refuse. Trompambentation. Water contamination was inevitable when every community dumped its waste into the nearest water source. Wells were regularly contaminated by nearby waste disposal sites, but people continued to drink from them because they had no alternatives. The connection between contaminated water and disease was occasionally recognized, but there was no infrastructure to provide clean water alternative. Medieval dental hygiene makes modern dentist visits seem like relaxing spa treatments. If you think avoiding the dentist for a year is bad, try living in an era where professional dental care didn't exist, and tooth pain was considered either divine punishment or demonic possession. Medieval people had to endure dental problems that would send anyone today straight to the emergency room. Toothbrushing wasn't completely unknown, but the methods were primitive and often harmful. People would rub their teeth with rough cloth, sometimes dipped in salt wine or honey. While salt could help clean teeth, rough cloth often damaged tooth enamel and irritated gums, causing more problems than it solved. Some people used their fingernails to scrape away food particles, which introduced bacteria and often caused cuts and infections. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist. Instead, people chewed on frayed twigs called chew sticks, usually made from trees with natural antibacterial properties like birch or oak. While this was actually not a terrible idea, the execution was problematic. People would use the same chew stick for months until it became a breeding ground for bacteria. They would also share chew sticks within families, spreading oral diseases and infections. Sugar was rare in medieval diets, so tooth decay wasn't as common as you might expect. But that doesn't mean medieval mouths were healthy places. Honey was the main sweetener, and it was still plenty capable of rotting teeth. Over time, more problematic was the medieval diet, which was often coarse and required significant chewing. This wore down teeth quickly, leaving sharp edges and exposed nerves that caused constant pain. Breath was a constant source of horror, since there was no effective way to clean teeth thoroughly. Plaque buildup was normal, and most people lived with a permanent coating of bacteria and food particles on their teeth. The smell of medieval breath was so universally terrible that it rarely merited comment unless someone's mouth was exceptionally foul, which tells you something about the baseline level of oral horror. Tooth extraction was the only real solution to serious dental problems, but it was performed by barbers, blacksmiths, or other tradespeople with no medical training, using crude tools like pliers or even simple rope. The process was done without anesthesia, while the patient was held down by several strong people. Imagine having a tooth pulled with a pair of rusty pliers, while fully conscious, and you'll start to understand why many people chose to live with excruciating pain rather than seek treatment. Pain management for dental problems was limited to alcohol, herbal remedies, or simply enduring the agony. People would chew on willow bark, which contains natural aspirin, but the relief was minimal and temporary. Severe toothaches could last for months or years, slowly driving people insane with constant pain. Some medieval accounts describe people begging for death rather than continuing to live with dental agony. Missing teeth were incredibly common, and people rarely had more than a few original teeth by middle age. This created serious nutritional problems since they couldn't properly chew many foods. They had to survive on soft porridge and broths, which led to malnutrition and further health problems. The cycle of poor nutrition, leading to weaker teeth, leading to more tooth loss, was a downward spiral that many people never escaped. Prespampsant teeth were sometimes attempted using animal teeth or carved bone, but these rarely worked well and often caused infections or additional problems. Wealthy people might have gold or silver teeth, which were status symbols, but also sources of constant oral pain and infection. The metals used were often impure and caused chemical burns or toxic reactions. Gum disease was rampant since there was no effective way to clean between teeth or below the gum line. People lived with chronically inflamed, swollen gums that would bleed at the slightest touch. Gingivitis and periodontitis were so common that they were considered normal parts of aging rather than preventable diseases. Children's teeth were often neglected even more than adults, since baby teeth were considered temporary and not worth maintaining. This meant that children often developed serious dental problems early in life, which affected their permanent teeth. The cycle of dental neglect started in infancy and continued throughout life. Wealthy people had slightly better options, including dental picks made from precious metals and access to imported spices that could help freshen breath. But even the richest nobles suffered from dental problems that would be easily preventable today. Having money might get you gold teeth, but it couldn't buy you actual dental health. Tooth whitening was attempted using abrasive substances like pumice stone or rough salt, but these methods often damaged tooth enamel, making teeth weaker and more susceptible to decay. The obsession with white teeth led people to use increasingly harsh substances that caused more harm than good. Dental infections were life-threatening since there were no antibiotics. A simple cavity could lead to abscesses that would spread infection throughout the body. Many medieval deaths attributed to fever or mysterious illness were actually caused by untreated dental infections that modern antibiotics could have cured in days. False teeth were attempted, but medieval technology wasn't advanced enough to create anything comfortable or functional. People might have wooden teeth or metal replacements, but these were painful, ill-fitting, and often caused more problems than having no teeth at all. Eating with medieval false teeth was an exercise in frustration and pain. Teeth were sometimes used as tools for tasks like tearing cloth, cracking nuts, or holding objects while working. This put additional stress on teeth that were already weakened by poor diet and lack of care. Using teeth as tools was so common that wear patterns on medieval skulls show characteristic damage from non-food related activities. Oral cancer and other mouth diseases were common, but completely misunderstood. People would live with tumors, growths, and lesions in their mouths without any treatment. These conditions were often attributed to curses, evil spirits, or divine punishment rather than medical conditions that might be treatable. The psychological impact of constant dental pain can't be overstated. Imagine trying to concentrate on daily tasks, work, or relationships while dealing with the throbbing agony of multiple infected teeth. Many people became irritable, depressed, and antisocial simply because they were in constant pain but had no way to address the source. Medieval food safety standards would horrify any modern health inspector. The gap between what people ate then and what we consider safe today is so vast that most medieval meals would be classified as biological weapons by contemporary standards. Yet somehow people survived, though many didn't. Those who did often suffered from chronic digestive problems that shortened their lives. Let's start with meat, which was the center of most medieval meals. When available, fresh meat was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford regularly. Most people ate meat that had been preserved through salting, smoking, or simply letting it age until it developed a crust of mold that was considered a sign of proper preservation. Imagine cutting through a thick layer of fuzzy green mold to get to your dinner. Underneath, puncturbals. Spoiled meat wasn't necessarily thrown away. Instead, medieval cooks developed elaborate spice blends designed to mask the taste and smell of rotting flesh. If meat smelled bad, they would soak it in wine or vinegar and cover it with expensive spices like cinnamon, cloves, or pepper. This didn't make the meat safe, it just made it tolerable to eat. The wealthy could afford these spices, so they ate more flavorful rotting meat, while the poor ate less appetizing rotting meat. Fish was even more problematic, since it spoiled quickly and refrigeration didn't exist. Coastal communities had access to fresh fish, but inland areas relied on salted or dried fish that was often months old by the time it was consumed. Fish that had gone bad was sometimes soaked in ale or wine in an attempt to revive it, but this just created alcoholic rotting fish, which was probably worse than the original poultry. Presented unique challenges, since chickens, ducks, and geese were often kept in close quarters. With humans sharing living spaces with their food sources, meant that meat was frequently contaminated with human waste and disease. Birds were often sick when slaughtered, but people ate them anyway because protein was scarce and waste was unthinkable. Preservation techniques were primitive and often dangerous. Smoking meat over fires that included toxic materials like certain woods or animal dung created carcinogenic compounds that slowly poisoned people over time. Salting required expensive salt, which was often contaminated with impurities, including heavy metals, that caused their own health problems. Dairy products were a constant gamble. Since pasteurization wouldn't be invented for centuries, Milk was consumed fresh when available, but it spoiled quickly in warm weather. Unpasteurized dairy carried risks of tuberculosis, brucellosis, and other diseases that could kill or cause lifelong health problems. Cheese was considered safer because the aging process killed some bacteria, but medieval cheese was often made in unsanitary conditions and contaminated with harmful microorganisms. Bread was a staple food, but medieval bread safety was questionable at best. Grain was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Eating ergot-contaminated bread led to outbreaks of what was called St. Anthony's fire, where entire communities would experience mass psychosis and physical symptoms that they attributed to demonic possession. Flour was frequently adulterated with sawdust, sand chalk, or other fillers to increase volume and profits. Bakers would mix these substances into bread dough, creating meals that were literally indigestible. Some people suffered from intestinal blockages and malnutrition because a significant portion of their daily bread was actually non-food substances. Storage of food was primitive and attracted vermin. Grain was kept in open containers that mice, rats, and insects could easily access. People would sift through their flour and grain before cooking, removing visible insects and rodent droppings, but the contamination was often too widespread to eliminate completely. Eating a diet that included regular doses of insect parts and rodent waste was simply part of medieval life. Trompedace water used for cooking was often contaminated since most communities disposed of waste in their water sources. People would cook with the same water they dumped their chamber pots into, creating a closed loop of contamination that guaranteed widespread disease. Wells were often located too close to waste disposal sites, ensuring that drinking and cooking water contained harmful bacteria. Vegetables and fruits were safer than meat, but still problematic. Human waste was used as fertilizer, which contaminated produce with parasites and bacteria. People would sometimes wash vegetables, but usually with the same contaminated water used for cooking, so the cleaning process often made things worse rather than better. Honey was the primary sweetener, but it was often harvested from wild beehives using methods that contaminated the honey with dirt, insects, and sometimes toxic plants that the bees had visited. Honey could contain spores that caused botulism in infants, but medieval people had no understanding of this risk. Alcoholic beverages were often safer than water since the alcohol killed some bacteria. But medieval brewing and winemaking practices were unsanitary. Beer and wine were made in containers that were rarely cleaned properly and often contaminated with harmful microorganisms. People might get drunk regularly, not for pleasure, but because alcohol was literally safer than water. Seasonal eating patterns meant that people often went months without fresh food, surviving on preserved items that had been stored since the previous harvest. By late winter, most stored food was either spoiled or on the verge of spoiling. People would eat increasingly questionable food as supplies dwindled, leading to spring sickness that was actually a combination of malnutrition and food poisoning. Cooking fires were often fueled with whatever was available, including animal dung, dried leaves, sometimes toxic materials that released harmful compounds into food. The smoke from these fires would permeate food with carcinogens and toxins, but people had no alternatives and couldn't afford to be picky about their fuel sources. Food sharing was common during communal meals, but it also spread disease rapidly. When one person had a communicable illness, sharing food and eating utensils ensured that entire families or communities would become infected. People would eat from common bowls, drink from shared cups, and use their hands to serve food, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. Spices and herbs used for flavoring were often contaminated or adulterated. Expensive spices were sometimes mixed with cheaper substances or even toxic materials to increase profits. People might pay premium prices for what they thought was pure cinnamon or pepper, only to receive a mixture that included harmful substances. Insects were a regular part of the medieval diet, not by choice but because they were impossible to eliminate from food storage. People would eat bread that was filled with weevils, porridge that contained various bugs, and dried fruit that was more insect than fruit. The protein from insects wasn't necessarily harmful, but the psychological impact of knowing your food was crawling with bugs must have been considerable. Wild foods gathered from forests and fields were often contaminated with parasites or toxic substances. People would eat berries, mushrooms, and plants without reliable ways to identify which ones were safe. Mushroom poisoning was common and often fatal. but people continued to gather wild mushrooms because they were free and added variety to monotonous diets. Medieval clothing practices created walking biological disasters that would be quarantined by modern health authorities. The relationship between clothing and cleanliness was so backwards that people often made themselves dirtier by getting dressed, and laundry practices were so rare and ineffective that most garments were literally worn until they disintegrated. Starting with the basics, most people owned very few pieces of clothing. A typical peasant might have 1 or 2 sets of garments that they wore continuously for months or even years. The wealthy had more options, but even nobles would wear the same outfit for weeks before changing. The concept of daily clothing changes was as foreign as space travel. Washing clothes was an enormous undertaking that required significant resources. Soap was expensive and often ineffective. Water had to be heated over fires, using precious fuel. The process took an entire day and provided questionable results, so most people simply avoided it altogether. Instead, they would air out garments, shake them vigorously, and hope that wind and time would somehow make them cleaner. When clothes were eventually washed, the methods were primitive and often damaged the fabric. People would pound garments against rocks, soak them in contaminated water, and use harsh substances like lye that could burn skin and destroy fibers. The process was so destructive that clothes often fell apart during washing, making the whole exercise counterproductive. Underwear was rare, and when it existed, it was never washed. People might have linen undergarments that were supposed to absorb sweat and oils, but these would be worn continuously until they rotted off the body. The smell of medieval underwear, after months of continuous wear, must have been indescribable. A concentrated essence of human funk that permeated every other layer of clothing. Layering was common, since it provided warmth and was supposed to help with cleanliness. The theory was that multiple layers would trap dirt and odors, keeping them away from the skin, but in practice this just created more surfaces for contamination to accumulate. People would wear 3 or 4 layers of clothing, each one becoming progressively more disgusting as it absorbed the funk from the layers beneath. Fabric choices were limited and often impractical. Wool was common, but it absorbed odors and was difficult to clean. Linen was preferred for undergarments because it could theoretically be washed, but it was expensive, and most people couldn't afford enough to change regularly. Silk was a luxury that only the wealthy could access, but even silk garments were worn for extended periods without cleaning. Clothing was often infested with parasites. Lice, fleas, and other insects lived in the fabric and were impossible to eliminate without proper washing. People accepted that their clothes would be crawling with bugs and developed various ineffective methods for dealing with them. They might turn garments inside out, shake them vigorously, or expose them to smoke, but the insects always returned. Repairs were constant, since clothes were worn until they literally fell apart. People would patch holes, mend tears, and reinforce weak spots, using whatever materials were available. Garments might be patched with different fabrics, creating patchwork outfits that looked like textile collages. The patches themselves were often dirty and contaminated, adding new sources of filth to already disgusting clothes. Dyeing practices involved toxic substances that were harmful to both the people who made the clothes and those who wore them. Medieval dyes included heavy metals, urine, animal blood, and various poisonous plants. Clothes dyed with these substances could cause skin irritation, chemical burns, and chronic health problems, but people wore them anyway because colored fabric was a status symbol. Storage of clothes was primitive and invited contamination. Garments were often kept in wooden chests or hung on pegs in damp, dirty rooms. Moths, mice, and other vermin would damage stored clothing, while mold and mildew would add their own aromatic contributions. Clothes that had been stored for months would emerge smelling like a combination of animal waste and decay. Shoes were particularly horrifying, since they were in constant contact with contaminated ground. Most people had only one pair of shoes that they wore continuously until they disintegrated. Medieval streets were covered with human waste, animal droppings, and rotting garbage, so shoes became vehicles for tracking filth everywhere. People went the inside of medieval shoes must have been breeding grounds for bacteria and fungal infections. Leather goods required special treatment that often made them more disgusting. Leather was preserved using animal urine, feces, and various toxic chemicals. The tanning process created items that were waterproof, but also permanently infused with the smell of rotting animal products. Leather clothing would never smell clean no matter how much it was aired out or treated. Seasonal clothing changes were rare. Even among the wealthy, people would wear the same basic garments year-round, simply adding or removing layers as needed. This meant that summer clothes absorbed months of sweat and body oils, while winter clothes became saturated with the concentrated funk of people who rarely bathed and lived in close quarters. Children's clothing was especially neglected, since children outgrew garments quickly. Parents saw no point in keeping children's clothes clean when they would be replaced soon anyway. Children would wear the same outfit until it became too small or completely fell apart, often passing garments down to younger siblings who would inherit months of accumulated filth. Tranquil. Occupational clothing created specific types of contamination. Blacksmiths wore leather aprons that absorbed sparks, smoke and metal particles. Butchers wore garments that were permanently stained with blood and animal fat. Farmers wore clothes that were caked with mud, manure and plant matter. Each profession had its own signature smell that became part of their professional identity. Religious garments were supposedly kept cleaner than secular clothing, but even monks and nuns struggled with laundry. Monks might change their robes a few times per year during religious festivals, but they also practiced physical mortification that made their bodies particularly fragrant. Nuns wore multiple layers of clothing that were rarely washed, creating their own aromatic challenges. Traveling clothes became especially disgusting since people on long journeys had no opportunities to change or clean their garments. Pilgrims, merchants and other travelers would wear the same outfit for weeks or months, accumulating dirt, sweat and various regional odors along their route. By the end of a long journey, their clothes would be archaeological records of everywhere they had been. Wealthy people tried to solve clothing problems by using expensive fabrics and employing servants to maintain their wardrobes. But even the richest nobles wore clothes that would be considered unwearable by modern standards. Servants responsible for clothing care often had no better understanding of cleanliness than their employers, so expensive garments were still worn until they were disgusting. They just looked slightly better while being disgusting. Medieval medicine was a fascinating combination of ancient wisdom, complete ignorance and practices so horrifying that they make modern medical errors seem like minor inconveniences. Doctors of the era operated under theories that were not just wrong, actively harmful, and their treatments often killed patients faster than the original diseases. Trombadals. The foundation of medieval medicine was the theory of humours, which held that the human body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these humours in perfect balance, so virtually every medical problem was treated by removing excess fluids from the body through bloodletting, purging or inducing vomiting. This meant that people who were already weakened by illness were further debilitated by treatments designed to drain them of vital fluids. Bloodletting was the most common medical procedure, and it was used to treat everything from headaches to plague. Doctors believed that most illnesses were caused by too much blood in the body, so they would make cuts in patients' arms or apply leeches to remove what they considered excess blood. People who were dying from blood loss due to injuries would often receive bloodletting as treatment, ensuring that they died even faster from the cure than they would have from the original problem. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper tools. Imagine having a limb amputated while fully conscious with a rusty saw, while several people hold you down to prevent movement. The shock and pain from medieval surgery killed many patients before their underlying conditions could, but doctors attributed these deaths to divine will rather than their brutal methods. Wound care was particularly horrifying. Since the concept of sterility was unknown, doctors would use the same unwashed tools on multiple patients, spreading infection from person to person. Open wounds were often packed with animal dung, honey, or various herbs that were more likely to cause infection than prevent it. The medieval approach to wound care virtually guaranteed that minor injuries would become life-threatening infections. Medieval doctors had an impressive arsenal of treatments that were universally harmful. Mercury was used to treat syphilis and other diseases, but mercury poisoning often killed patients before the original illness could lead. Poisoning was common from treatments that included lead-based compounds. Arsenic was prescribed for various ailments, and while it occasionally killed parasites, it more often killed the patients themselves. Mental illness was attributed to demonic possession. evil spirits, or divine punishment rather than medical conditions. People suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological problems were often subjected to exorcisms, physical abuse, or being chained in dungeons. The treatments for mental illness were so brutal that many patients died from the cure rather than living with their original conditions. Childbirth was an especially dangerous time for both mothers and babies since medical knowledge about pregnancy and delivery was virtually non-existent. Midwives had some practical experience, but they also subscribed to harmful theories about childbirth that increased mortality rates. Women were often given ergot to speed labor, but ergot could cause hemorrhaging and death. Babies who survived birth often died from infections caused by unsanitary delivery practices. Plague treatments were particularly horrifying since doctors had no understanding of what caused the disease. They would lance buboes with dirty knives spreading infection. They would prescribe treatments that included drinking ground unicorn horn, eating crushed emeralds, or sitting near bad-smelling substances to drive away the evil air that supposedly caused plague. These treatments were not only useless but often hastened death by weakening patients further. Dental extraction was performed by barbers using crude tools, and no pain relief teeth were pulled with pliers, or sometimes tied to strings attached to slamming doors. The trauma from dental procedures often caused patients to go into shock, die from blood loss, or develop infections that spread to their brains. Yet people endured these procedures because dental pain was so severe that they preferred the risk of death to continued suffering. Eye problems were treated with methods that often caused blindness. Doctors would poke patients' eyes with sharp instruments, pour various liquids into them, or recommend staring directly at the sun as therapy. Cataracts were sometimes treated by pushing the clouded lens into the back of the eye with a sharp needle. This occasionally improved vision temporarily, but usually resulted in complete blindness. Infection. Broken bones were set without proper knowledge of anatomy, so they often healed incorrectly, leaving patients permanently disabled. Doctors would sometimes re-break bones that had healed poorly and attempt to reset them, but this usually made the problem worse. People with broken bones were often better off receiving no treatment than submitting to medieval medical care. Trompadent skin diseases were treated with caustic substances that burned healthy tissue along with diseased areas. Doctors would apply acids, lye, or heated metals to skin conditions, believing that burning away affected areas would cure the problem. These treatments left patients scarred, disfigured, and often worse off than before treatment. Internal medicine was based on the theory that illness was caused by blockages in the body, so doctors would prescribe powerful laxatives and emetics to clear out the system. People would be given substances that caused violent diarrhea and vomiting, often for days at a time. This dehydration, electrolyte imbalance killed many patients who might have recovered from their original illnesses. Pain relief was limited to alcohol, herbal remedies that were often ineffective, or dangerous substances like opium that were rare and expensive. Most people endured surgery, tooth extraction, and other painful procedures with no pain relief whatsoever. The psychological trauma from medical procedures was often as damaging as the physical effects. Anatomy knowledge was based on ancient texts rather than actual observation of human bodies. Doctors performed treatments based on theories about how they thought the body worked rather than actual knowledge. Medical schools taught students to memorize ancient writings rather than examine real patients, so medical knowledge became increasingly divorced from reality. Hospital care was often worse than staying home. Medieval hospitals were overcrowded, unsanitary, and staffed by people with minimal medical knowledge. Patients with different diseases were housed together, ensuring that infections spread rapidly. Many people who entered hospitals with minor ailments died from diseases they contracted while receiving care. Drug preparations were unregulated and often contained harmful substances. Apothecaries would mix medications using contaminated ingredients or substitute expensive components with cheaper alternatives that were sometimes toxic. People had no way of knowing what they were actually consuming when they took medieval medicines, and many died from the treatments rather than their original conditions. Diagnostic methods were primitive and often involved examining urine color and taste. Doctors would literally taste patients' urine to diagnose diseases. This practice spread infections between doctors and patients while providing no useful medical information. Diseases were often misdiagnosed, leading to inappropriate treatments that made conditions worse. Surgical instruments were crude and unsanitary. The same tools were used for multiple procedures without cleaning, spreading disease from patient to patient. Medieval surgery had an extremely high mortality rate, not just from the procedures themselves, but from the infections that almost inevitably followed. Medical education was based on memorizing ancient texts rather than practical experience. Medical students learned theory without ever examining real patients or understanding how the human body actually functioned. This created generations of doctors who were confident in their knowledge, but completely incompetent in actual medical care. Religious influence on medicine meant that many effective treatments were forbidden, while harmful practices were encouraged. The church taught that suffering was spiritually beneficial, so pain relief was sometimes considered sinful. Doctors who challenged church teachings about medicine risked being accused of heresy. Experimental medicine was often conducted on poor people, who had no choice but to accept whatever treatment was offered. Wealthy patients could afford to be selective about their medical care, but the poor were subjected to whatever experimental procedures doctors wanted to try. This created a system where medical knowledge advanced through experimenting on the most vulnerable members of society. Medieval water sources were so contaminated that drinking water was essentially playing Russian roulette with your digestive system. The irony is that water, the most basic necessity for human survival, had become one of the deadliest substances people regularly consumed in their daily lives. Yet alternatives were limited, and people had no choice but to drink from sources they knew were dangerous. Wells were the primary source of drinking water for most communities, but medieval well placement and maintenance practices virtually guaranteed contamination. People would dig wells wherever convenient, without considering what might be upstream or upwind from their water source. It was common to find wells located directly downhill from cemeteries, latrines, animal pens, and waste disposal sites. The wealthy sometimes had private wells, but even these were often contaminated since they had no understanding of groundwater contamination. A private well might seem cleaner than a public one, but if it was located near a cesspit or animal waste, it was just as dangerous. Rich people died from waterborne diseases just as frequently as the poor. They just had nicer containers to drink their contaminated water from. Urban water supplies were nightmarish since cities concentrated waste and people in small areas without adequate disposal systems. Major cities would have dozens of wells serving thousands of people, while the same communities dumped their human waste, animal waste, and industrial runoff into the ground that fed those wells. It was a closed loop of contamination that guaranteed widespread disease. Rivers and streams were used as both water sources and waste disposal sites. Communities would draw drinking water from the same rivers they used as sewers, often within a few hundred yards of each other. People upstream would dump their waste into the river while people downstream would drink from it, creating a cascade of contamination that flowed along every. Water storage was primitive and invited additional contamination. People would store water in wooden barrels, clay pots, or animal skins that were rarely cleaned properly. Stored water would develop algae, bacterial growth, and infestations of insects and worms, but people drank it anyway, because they had no alternatives. Drinking water that had been stored for weeks was often more dangerous than drinking directly from contaminated sources. Seasonal variations made water quality even more unpredictable. During dry seasons, water sources would become concentrated with contaminants, while wet seasons would wash additional waste into water supplies. Spring floods would carry human waste, animal carcasses, and other contamination from wide areas into drinking water sources. People never knew what they might be consuming when they drew water from their usual sources. Animal contamination was constant since livestock and wildlife shared water sources with humans. Cattle, pigs, chickens, and other animals would drink from and defecate in the same streams and ponds that people used for drinking water. Wild animals would also contaminate water sources, and during disease outbreaks among animals, the water would carry those diseases to human population. Industrial pollution was a growing problem in areas with metalworking, tanning, or other trades. These industries would dump toxic chemicals, heavy metals, and other harmful substances directly into water sources, without any consideration for downstream users. People living near these industries would consume water contaminated with lead, mercury, and other substances that caused chronic poisoning. Water treatment was non-existent. People had no methods for purifying water beyond letting it sit in containers, hoping that sediment would settle out. But this did nothing to address bacterial contamination or chemical pollution. Some people would boil water occasionally, but this was expensive in terms of fuel and time, so it was rarely done consistently. Taste and smell were unreliable indicators of water safety. Contaminated water often tasted and smelled normal, while clean-looking water might be deadly. People would avoid water that looked obviously foul, but they would readily drink water that was invisibly contaminated with deadly bacteria or parasites. The most dangerous water was often the most appealing to drink. Disease transmission through water was constant, but poorly understood. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases regularly swept through communities, killing thousands, but people attributed these outbreaks to divine punishment, bad air, or supernatural causes, rather than their contaminated water supplies. They would pray for relief, while continuing to drink from the same sources that were making them sick. Children were especially vulnerable to waterborne diseases, since they had less developed immune systems and often drank more water relative to their body weight. Infant mortality was extremely high, and much of it was directly related to contaminated water supplies. Families would lose multiple children to diseases that could have been prevented with clean water. Traveling presented unique water challenges, since people had to drink from unfamiliar sources along their routes. Pilgrims, merchants, and other travelers would consume water from dozens of different contaminated sources during long journeys, often picking up multiple diseases along the way. Many people became seriously ill or died during travel simply from drinking water at different stops. Alcohol was often safer than water since the brewing process killed some bacteria, but it wasn't a complete solution. Beer and wine were also made with contaminated water, and the alcohol content wasn't always sufficient to eliminate all harmful microorganisms. People would get drunk regularly, not for pleasure, but because alcoholic beverages were literally safer than water. Milk was sometimes used as a water substitute, but unpasteurized milk carried its own risks, including tuberculosis, brucellosis, and other diseases that could be fatal. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, and sour milk was often consumed because people had no alternatives. Dairy products provided some relief from contaminated water but created new health hazards. Rainwater collection was attempted, but medieval collection methods introduced their own contamination. People would collect rainwater from roofs that were covered with bird droppings, animal waste, and other contaminants. The collection containers were rarely clean, and rainwater would often sit for long periods, developing bacterial growth before consumption. Ice was occasionally available during winter, but it was usually cut from the same contaminated water sources that people avoided drinking from during warmer months. Frozen contaminated water was still contaminated water, but people would consume it thinking that freezing had somehow purified it. The process of cutting, storing, and handling ice also introduced additional contamination. Water vendors existed in some cities selling water that was supposedly cleaner than local sources, but these vendors often simply drew water from slightly more distant contaminated sources and charged premium prices for it. People would pay extra for water that was just as dangerous as what they could get for free from local wells. Cross-impacted toward water were complicated, since water was used for baptism and other sacred rituals, while also being recognized as dangerous. Priests would bless water for religious purposes, but this spiritual purification had no effect on bacterial contamination. People would drink blessed water, thinking it was safer, but it carried the same risks as any other medieval water source. Medieval working conditions were so dangerous and unsanitary that modern safety regulations would shut down every workplace within minutes. But for people living in those times, these horrific conditions were simply accepted as normal parts of earning a living. Each profession had its own unique blend of health hazards, toxic exposures, and life-threatening risks that workers endured without complaint or compensation. Farming was the most common occupation, and it exposed workers to constant contamination. Farmers worked in fields, fertilized with human waste, ensuring that they were regularly exposed to parasites, bacteria, and other disease-causing organisms. They would handle contaminated soil with bare hands, often while having open cuts or wounds that provided direct entry points for infections. The life expectancy of medieval farmers was significantly reduced by constant exposure to biological hazards that would require hazmat suits today. Metalworking exposed workers to toxic fumes and dangerous chemicals. Blacksmiths, armorers, and other metal workers would spend their days breathing smoke filled with lead, mercury, and other heavy metals, while working over fires that reached dangerous temperatures without any protective equipment. The workspace was typically a small enclosed area that concentrated toxic fumes, ensuring that workers received maximum exposure to harmful substances. Lung disease and metal poisoning were occupational hazards that killed most metal workers before old age. Textile work was dominated by women who were exposed to their own unique set of health hazards. Spinning and weaving were often done in poorly ventilated spaces filled with fibers that workers would inhale throughout the day, leading to lung problems similar to modern black lung disease. The dyes used in textile work contained toxic chemicals including arsenic, lead, and mercury that were absorbed through the skin and inhaled as vapors. Textile workers often developed skin conditions, respiratory problems, and neurological issues from chronic exposure to these substances. Construction work was incredibly dangerous since medieval building techniques relied on primitive tools and unsafe practices. Workers would construct multi-story buildings without safety equipment or proper scaffolding. Falls were common and often fatal, but even workers who avoided major accidents were exposed to constant health hazards. Stone dust from cutting and shaping building materials caused lung disease, while the lime used in mortar could cause chemical burns and respiratory problems. Food preparation was a source of constant contamination, since cooks and food handlers worked with spoiled ingredients in unsanitary conditions. Butchers would slaughter animals in the same spaces where they prepared food for customers, often without cleaning between tasks. Bakers worked in hot, dusty environments where grain contaminated with insects and rodent droppings was processed into bread that would be sold to the public. Food workers regularly consumed contaminated products as part of their daily meals, ensuring that they suffered from chronic digestive problems. Tanning and leatherwork exposed workers to some of the most toxic substances used in medieval times. Leather was preserved using animal urine, feces, and various poisonous chemicals. Tanners worked in environments saturated with ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and other gases that could cause immediate illness or death. Workers in tanneries had some of the shortest life expectancies of any profession and were often banned from living within city limits because of the smell and health hazards they carried. Mining was extraordinarily dangerous work that combined immediate physical risks with long-term health consequences. Miners worked in unstable underground conditions where cave-ins were common and often fatal, but even miners who avoided accidents were exposed to toxic dust and gases that caused lung disease and poisoning. Different types of mining exposed workers to specific hazards. Lead miners developed lead poisoning, while coal miners suffered from black lung disease, and salt miners were exposed to caustic substances that damaged skin and respiratory system. Waste disposal workers had perhaps the most contaminated work environment of any profession. They collected human waste, animal waste, and garbage from throughout communities, while having constant exposure to disease-causing organisms. These workers often lived shorter lives than any other group, were frequently banned from social gatherings because of the contamination they carried. Their work was essential for community health, but it virtually guaranteed that they would suffer from chronic illness and early death. Transportation work exposed people to unique hazards since travel was dangerous and unpredictable. Wagon drivers and boat operators were exposed to extreme weather, contaminated water, and spoiled food during long journeys. They also faced constant risk of accidents that could leave them stranded in dangerous conditions without medical care. Many transportation workers disappeared during routine trips and were never seen again. Domestic service exposed workers to the concentrated filth of their employers' households. Servants were responsible for emptying chamber pots, cleaning contaminated clothing, and preparing food in unsanitary conditions, while living in crowded quarters that facilitated disease transmission. Domestic workers often suffered from the same diseases as their employers but received no medical care and were expected to continue working, even while seriously ill. Military service combined all the worst aspects of medieval working conditions. Soldiers lived in crowded, unsanitary camps where disease spread rapidly, while being exposed to combat injuries that were often fatal due to poor medical care. Military campaigns exposed soldiers to contaminated water, spoiled food, and extreme weather conditions that killed more people than actual fighting. Armies were essentially mobile disease factories that spread contamination wherever they went. Religious workers were not exempt from occupational hazards despite their supposedly pure lifestyle. Monks and nuns lived in crowded monasteries where disease spread easily, while following extreme dietary restrictions that weakened their immune systems. They also practiced physical mortification that deliberately caused injury and infection. Religious communities regularly experienced outbreaks of disease that killed significant portions of their population. Artisan work exposed people to specific toxic substances depending on their craft. Pottery workers were exposed to lead glazes that caused poisoning, while jewelry makers worked with mercury and other heavy metals that accumulated in their bodies over time. Each craft had its own signature health problems that were accepted as normal consequences of earning a living in that profession. Apprentice workers were often the most exploited since they had no choice but to accept whatever working conditions were offered to them. Young people would be exposed to the same health hazards as adult workers, while receiving minimal food and no medical care. Apprentices who became seriously ill were often abandoned by their masters and left to die rather than receiving treatment that might allow them to recover. Seasonal work created additional hazards, since workers would be exposed to different types of contamination at different times of year. Harvest workers would be exposed to grain dust and contaminated crops, while construction workers faced extreme weather conditions that could be fatal without proper shelter. Seasonal workers had no job security and often worked in the most dangerous conditions because they had no alternatives. Child labor was common and exposed young people to the same hazards as adults, without any special protections. Children worked in mines, textile mills and other dangerous environments, while their developing bodies were especially vulnerable to toxic exposures. Many children died from occupational diseases before reaching adulthood, while others suffered lifelong health problems from childhood exposure to workplace hazards. Workplace injuries were common and often fatal, since there was no emergency medical care or compensation for injured workers. A minor accident that would require a few stitches today could easily become a life-threatening infection in medieval times. Workers who were seriously injured were often left to recover on their own, or simply abandoned if they could no longer perform their duties. Medieval cities were essentially concentrated disasters where thousands of people lived in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards. Urban planning, as we understand it, simply didn't exist, and the results were communities that were breeding grounds for disease, violence, and social collapse. Yet, these cities were considered the height of civilization and centers of commerce, culture, and learning. Streets were not paved roads, but rather tracks of compacted dirt that became muddy swamps during rain and dusty clouds during dry weather. But the dirt wasn't just soil. It was a mixture of human waste, animal droppings, food scraps, and general refuse that had been trampled down over years of foot traffic. Walking through a medieval city meant navigating through layers of compressed filth that had accumulated over generations. Waste disposal was handled by the simple expedient of throwing everything out the nearest window. Chamber pot contents would be hurled into the streets along with food, scraps, dead animals, and any other unwanted materials. People would shout warnings before dumping waste, but this was more about avoiding immediate splashing than any concern for sanitation. The streets became rivers of sewage that flowed toward whatever low point was available. Drainage systems were non-existent or so primitive that they often made problems worse. Cities built along rivers would dump everything into the water, while landlocked communities would create stagnant pools of contaminated water that bred disease. Gutters, when they existed, were open trenches filled with waste that would overflow during heavy rains, flooding entire neighborhoods with sewage. Building construction created additional health hazards, since structures were built without consideration for sanitation or ventilation. Houses were constructed directly over waste disposal sites, while shops and workshops dumped their refuse into the foundations of neighboring buildings. The result was that every structure was slowly sinking into a foundation of compressed garbage and human waste. Air quality in medieval cities was so poor that visitors from rural areas would often become physically ill from breathing the concentrated pollution smoke from cooking fires, workshops, and waste burning, combined with the gases from decomposing organic matter to create an atmosphere that was genuinely toxic. People developed chronic respiratory problems simply from living in cities, and the life expectancy of urban dwellers was significantly lower than rural population. Overcrowding was extreme since cities attracted people seeking economic opportunities, but had no infrastructure to support growing populations. Families would live in single rooms, while multiple families shared buildings that were barely large enough for one household. Privacy was non-existent, and the close quarters ensured that diseases would spread rapidly through entire neighborhoods. Water supplies were completely inadequate for urban populations. Cities would have a few wells or water sources that served thousands of people, while the same communities generated massive amounts of waste that contaminated those water sources. The mathematical impossibility of providing clean water to dense populations using medieval technology meant that waterborne diseases were constant features of urban life. Markets and food distribution were sources of additional contamination. Since there was no refrigeration or effective preservation, food would spoil quickly while being handled by multiple people. Vendors would sell meat that had been sitting in the heat for days, while customers would handle and reject food items that would then be sold to other customers. The entire food distribution system was designed to spread contamination as widely as possible. Industrial activities within cities created toxic pollution that affected entire communities. Metalworking, tanning, leatherwork, and other trades would release poisonous fumes and dump contaminated waste directly into urban environments. People lived and worked in close proximity to industrial sites that would require extensive environmental cleanup by modern standards. Animal husbandry within city limits meant that livestock shared living spaces with humans, creating additional sources of contamination. Pigs, chickens, and other animals would roam freely through streets, while larger livestock was kept in areas that also served as human housing. The waste from these animals added to the already overwhelming sanitation problems. Fire was a constant threat since buildings were constructed of flammable materials. People used open flames for cooking, heating, and lighting. Entire neighborhoods would regularly burn down, but the rebuilding process simply recreated the same hazardous conditions that had caused the original fires. Urban fires were often welcomed as the only effective method of urban renewal available. Crime and violence were rampant in conditions where people were constantly stressed by poor living conditions and competition for resources. Cities had minimal law enforcement, and the legal system was often more corrupt than the criminals. It was supposed to control people lived in constant fear of theft, assault, and murder, while having little recourse for protection. Noise pollution was severe since cities concentrated all human activities into small areas. The sounds of workshops, animals, people, and various urban activities created constant noise that would drive modern people to distraction. There was no quiet space in medieval cities, and the constant noise contributed to stress and health problems. Religious buildings were often the only well-maintained structures in cities, but even churches and monasteries suffered from the same sanitation problems as secular buildings. Religious communities would build elaborate structures while ignoring basic infrastructure needs like waste disposal and clean water. The contrast between beautiful religious architecture and horrific living conditions was a defining feature of medieval cities. Social services were non-existent, so people who became ill, injured, or unable to work were simply left to die in the streets. Cities had no systems for dealing with orphans, widows, disabled people, or the elderly who couldn't care for themselves. The result was that urban areas were filled with desperate people who had no alternatives to begging, stealing, or prostitution. Economic inequality was extreme, since cities attracted both wealthy merchants and desperate poor people. The wealthy could afford to live in slightly better conditions, while the poor were concentrated in the worst areas of cities. But even the wealthy lived in conditions that would be considered unacceptable today. The difference between rich and poor was often just a matter of having a few more rooms in the same contaminated environment. Education and literacy were limited to small elite groups, while the majority of urban populations lived in ignorance of basic health and safety principles. People had no understanding of disease transmission, sanitation, or nutrition, so they continued to live in ways that guaranteed poor health and early death. The lack of knowledge meant that even well-intentioned efforts to improve conditions often made things worse. Medieval entertainment was as unsanitary and dangerous as every other aspect of life. But people desperately needed diversions from their harsh existence, so they gathered for activities that combined amusement with additional health hazards. These entertainments were often more dangerous than daily work. but they provided psychological relief that people considered worth the physical risks. Public festivals were massive gatherings where thousands of people would crowd together in unsanitary conditions for days at a time. These festivals featured food vendors selling questionable products, performers who traveled from contaminated community to contaminated community, and activities that exposed participants to additional disease risks. Festivals were essentially disease superspreader events where people from wide geographic areas would gather, exchange contamination, and then return to their home communities, carrying new illnesses. Taverns and alehouses were social centers where people gathered to drink, eat, and socialize, but these establishments were breeding grounds for disease and violence. Tavern keepers would serve alcohol that was often contaminated, food that was frequently spoiled, and provide accommodations that were little more than communal sleeping arrangements where disease spread rapidly. Fights were common and often fatal, while the combination of alcohol, contaminated food, and close quarters created perfect conditions for outbreaks of various illnesses. Gambling was popular entertainment that brought people together in close quarters to handle shared objects and exchange money that had passed through countless contaminated hands. Dice cards and other gaming materials were never cleaned and carried diseases from player to player. Gambling halls were often located in the worst parts of cities where sanitation was poorest and criminal activity was highest. Blood sports were common entertainment that exposed both participants and spectators to additional health hazards. Cockfighting, bear baiting, and other animal contests created opportunities for animal-to-human disease transmission. While the crowds gathered to watch these events provided ideal conditions for human-to-human contamination, the animals used in these sports were often diseased, and the close contact with animal blood and waste created additional infection risks. Public executions were major social events that drew huge crowds to witness brutal punishments. These gatherings were opportunities for disease transmission, while the methods of execution often involved practices that spread contamination. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, and other execution methods created scenes of blood and gore that attracted flies and other disease vectors, while crowds gathered in close proximity breathed the same air and often fought for better viewing positions. Markets and fairs were combination commercial and entertainment events where people would travel significant distances to buy, sell, and socialize. These gatherings brought together people from different communities along with their regional diseases and contamination. Market goods were handled by multiple people. Food was prepared in unsanitary conditions, and the crowds created ideal conditions for pickpockets, cutthroats, and disease transmission. Religious festivals combined spiritual observance with social gathering, but even these supposedly holy events were sources of contamination. Pilgrimages brought together people from vast geographic areas who would share food, water, accommodations, while visiting religious sites that were often unsanitary and overcrowded. The combination of religious fervor, poor sanitation, and large crowds created conditions where diseases could spread rapidly among populations that considered themselves blessed. Traveling entertainers brought contamination from community to community as they moved from place to place, performing for audiences. Minstrels, acrobats, and other performers would carry diseases from their previous stops and pick up new infections at each location. They visited. Their performances often involved close contact with audience members, ensuring maximum opportunity for disease transmission. Dancing and communal celebrations involved close physical contact between participants who were already carrying the normal medieval complement of parasites and diseases. Folk dancing and other group activities meant that people would touch each other, handle shared objects, and breathe the same air while engaging in physical activity that increased respiration and circulation. These celebrations were joyful, but also highly effective methods of spreading whatever diseases were present in the community. Storytelling and oral entertainment brought people together in enclosed spaces where they would share air for extended periods. Professional storytellers would travel from community to community, carrying news, entertainment, and diseases along their routes. Audiences would gather in close quarters to hear stories while breathing contaminated air and often sharing food and drink during performances. Bathing as entertainment was occasionally practiced in some communities, where public bathhouses served social as well as hygiene functions. But these facilities were sources of disease transmission rather than cleanliness. The same water would be shared by dozens of people throughout the day, and the warm conditions were ideal for bacterial growth. Bathhouses were often associated with prostitution and criminal activity, adding violence and sexual disease transmission to the other health risks. Seasonal celebrations involved community-wide activities that exposed entire populations to additional contamination. Harvest festivals, winter celebrations and spring rituals brought together people who had been isolated during other seasons, allowing diseases to spread through populations that had developed some immunity to local conditions, but were vulnerable to infections brought by visitors from other areas. Hunting and outdoor recreation exposed participants to wildlife diseases and environmental hazards, while also creating opportunities for accidents that could be fatal without proper medical care. Hunting parties would often camp in unsanitary conditions, share contaminated food and water, and engage in activities that could result in serious injuries. Hunting was considered noble entertainment, but it carried significant health risks. Competitive sports and physical contests were popular but dangerous forms of entertainment. Wrestling, archery contests, and early forms of football involved physical contact that could spread disease while also creating opportunities for injuries that were often fatal without proper medical treatment. These contests were often held in conjunction with festivals or markets, ensuring that any injuries would be witnessed by large crowds but treated by people with no medical knowledge. Medieval death and burial practices created their own unique health hazards that often posed greater risks to the living than the original diseases that had killed the deceased. The concept of proper sanitation in death was as foreign as proper sanitation in life, and burial practices were designed more for spiritual concerns than public health. Preparation of bodies for burial was done by family members or community volunteers who had no understanding of disease transmission. Bodies were washed, dressed, and often kept in homes for several days before burial. During this time, decomposition would begin, and family members would be exposed to whatever diseases had killed the deceased, along with the general contamination that came from handling decomposing bodies. Embalming was rare and primitive when it was attempted, so bodies would begin decomposing immediately after death. The smell of decomposition was accepted as normal, and people would continue their daily activities while living with decomposing relatives in their homes. Viewings and wakes exposed entire families and communities to disease risks, while creating opportunities for respiratory infections and other illnesses to spread. Burial sites were often located too close to water sources and residential areas since space was limited and people wanted to bury their dead near their communities. Cemeteries were frequently placed upstream from wells or near areas where people gathered, ensuring that decomposition products would contaminate water supplies and create ongoing health hazards for the living. Mass graves were common during plague outbreaks and other disasters when individual burials became impossible. These pits would contain hundreds of bodies that were buried without proper preparation or separation, creating massive sources of contamination that could affect groundwater and air quality for years after the burials. Mass grave sites often became permanently contaminated areas that were avoided by the living. Church burial was considered spiritually superior to other options. Churches were often located in the centers of communities where space was limited. Bodies would be buried under church floors or in small churchyards that became overcrowded, and contaminated church services would be conducted over multiple layers of decomposing bodies, while congregations breathed air contaminated with decomposition gases. Preservation of bodies was attempted using methods that were often more dangerous than helpful. Salt was expensive, so people would use other substances, including animal waste and toxic chemicals, to slow decomposition. These preservation methods often created additional health hazards for the people who handled the bodies while failing to actually preserve them effectively. Funeral practices involved large gatherings where people would share food, drink, and air while mourning the deceased. These gatherings provided opportunities for disease transmission, especially when the death had been caused by a contagious illness. Mourners would often kiss or touch the deceased as part of funeral rituals, ensuring direct contact with whatever had killed them. Infant and child mortality was so high that special burial practices developed for young people, but these practices were often even less sanitary than adult burials. Infant bodies were sometimes buried in shallow graves or simply disposed of in ways that created additional contamination. Children who died from infectious diseases were often buried quickly without proper preparation, creating ongoing sources of infection. Execution victims, criminals, were sometimes buried in special areas that were even less maintained than regular cemeteries. These burial sites were often located near waste disposal areas or in marshy ground that was unsuitable for other purposes. The combination of poor burial conditions and the social stigma associated with these sites meant that they became concentrated sources of contamination. Plague victims presented special challenges since their diseases were highly contagious and they often died in large numbers, overwhelming normal burial capacity. During plague outbreaks, bodies would be collected in carts and dumped in mass graves with minimal preparation. The people responsible for collecting and burying plague victims had extremely high mortality rates from constant exposure to infected bodies. Exhumation was occasionally necessary when burial sites needed to be moved or when bodies were suspected of causing ongoing problems, but medieval people had no understanding of how to safely handle decomposed remains. Exhumation exposed workers to concentrated contamination, while often spreading diseases that had been contained in burial sites. Grave robbery was common since people were often buried with valuable possessions, but grave robbers were frequently exposed to deadly diseases from handling contaminated remains. Many grave robbers died from infections contracted during their illegal activities, while others spread diseases they had contracted in graveyards to the general population. Religious relics often involved body parts of deceased holy people that were preserved and venerated, but these relics were sources of disease transmission disguised as religious devotion. People would kiss, touch, and pray over decomposing body parts, believing they were receiving spiritual benefits, while actually exposing themselves to various infections. Autopsy and medical examination of bodies was rare, but when it was attempted, it was done without any protective equipment or understanding of disease transmission. Medical students and doctors would handle decomposing bodies with bare hands, often while eating or drinking, creating maximum opportunities for disease transmission. Medical schools had extremely high mortality rates among students and faculty. Cremation was rare in Christian communities, since it was considered ritually inappropriate. But when it was practiced, it was done using methods that created air pollution and exposed workers to toxic fumes. Bodies would be burned using whatever fuel was available, often creating smoke filled with harmful chemicals and disease particles that would be inhaled by anyone in the area. Memorial practices often involved keeping physical reminders of the deceased, including clothing, personal items, and sometimes body parts. These memorial objects would retain contamination from the deceased and continue to pose health risks to family members who handled them. Regularly, people would preserve contaminated items for years without understanding that they were maintaining ongoing sources of infection. Medieval child-rearing practices were so dangerous that surviving to adulthood was considered a remarkable achievement. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, not just from disease and malnutrition, but from childcare practices that would be considered criminal neglect by modern standards. Yet these practices were considered normal and caring by medieval parents who were doing their best with the knowledge and resources available to them. Birth itself was extraordinarily dangerous since midwives had no understanding of sterile technique, and childbirth took place in unsanitary conditions. Babies were often born into environments contaminated with human waste and delivered by people who had not washed their hands. Mothers and babies both faced high risks of infection from delivery practices that introduced bacteria directly into open wounds. Chompedation. Feeding practices for infants were particularly hazardous since baby formula didn't exist, and not all mothers could breastfeed successfully. Wet nurses were sometimes available, but they often carried diseases that would be transmitted to multiple babies. Cow's milk and other animal milk was frequently contaminated and spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration, babies were sometimes fed chewed food from adults' mouths, creating direct transmission of adult diseases to vulnerable infants. Sleeping arrangements exposed babies to additional risks, since they often shared beds with parents and siblings in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Sudden infant death was common, and was often attributed to supernatural causes, rather than suffocation or disease. Co-sleeping, in medieval conditions, meant that babies were exposed to the concentrated body odors, diseases and parasites of their entire family. Hygiene care for babies was minimal, since clean water was scarce and people believed that bathing was dangerous. Babies would go weeks or months without being cleaned beyond having their faces wiped with whatever cloth was available. Diaper changing involved reusing the same cloths repeatedly without proper washing, creating perfect conditions for bacterial growth and skin infections. Weaning practices introduced babies to contaminated adult food at early ages, since there were no specially prepared baby foods. Infants were given whatever the family was eating, including spoiled meat, contaminated water, and food that was too hard for them to digest properly. Early weaning often led to malnutrition and disease as babies' digestive systems couldn't handle adult food. Child mortality was so high that parents often delayed naming babies or forming emotional attachments until children showed signs of surviving their first few years. This psychological protection mechanism meant that babies received less attentive care during their most vulnerable period, creating a cycle where lack of care increased mortality, which led to less emotional investment in child survival. Medical care for children was even more primitive than adult medicine, since children were considered miniature adults rather than people with unique medical needs. Sick children were often given the same brutal treatments as adults, including bloodletting, purging, and toxic medications that were harmful to adult patients and often fatal to children. Education and development were neglected, since survival was the primary concern. Children who lived long enough to work were expected to contribute to family labor from early ages rather than receive education or developmental support. Child labor exposed young people to the same workplace hazards as adults, while their developing bodies were especially vulnerable to toxic exposures and physical damage. Play and recreation for children often involved dangerous activities since there were no safety standards or protective equipment. Children would play with sharp objects, climb unstable structures, and explore contaminated areas without supervision. Childhood games often involved activities that would result in serious injuries or exposure to diseases, but these risks were considered normal parts of growing up. Discipline practices were harsh and often dangerous, since physical punishment was considered necessary for proper child development. Children were beaten with various implements exposed to extreme weather as punishment and sometimes deliberately injured as lessons in obedience. These disciplinary measures often caused permanent physical damage or death, but were considered necessary for moral development. Clothing for children was minimal and often inadequate, since fabric was expensive and children outgrew garments quickly. Children would wear the same clothes for months until they literally fell apart, then inherit used clothing from older siblings or other families. Child clothing was rarely washed and often infested with parasites that caused skin diseases and other health problems. Nutrition for children was poor, since they received whatever food was available after adults had eaten. Children were often malnourished, even in families that had adequate food, since the best nutrition was reserved for working adults who generated income. Malnutrition weakened children's immune systems, making them more vulnerable to diseases and infections. Social development was hindered by the harsh realities of medieval life. Children learned to expect violence, disease, and early death as normal parts of existence. They were exposed to adult problems, including sexuality, violence, and death from early ages, without any psychological preparation or support systems to help them process traumatic experiences. Abandonment and orphaning were common since parents often died young or couldn't afford to care for all their children. Abandoned children would become street beggars, prostitutes, or simply die from exposure and starvation. Orphaned children had no social support systems and were often exploited by adults who saw them as free labor or worse. Religious education for children focused more on fear and punishment than spiritual development. Children were taught that they were inherently sinful and that suffering was spiritually beneficial. This psychological conditioning prepared them for lives of hardship, but also created trauma and mental health problems that affected their ability to form healthy relationships or make good decisions. Marriage and sexual education for children was non-existent, since marriages were often arranged while children were young, and sexual maturity was considered the beginning of adulthood rather than a developmental stage that required guidance. Young people entered sexual relationships without understanding reproduction, disease transmission, or emotional development, leading to early pregnancy, dangerous childbirths, and sexually transmitted diseases. Developmental disabilities and mental health problems in children were attributed to supernatural causes rather than medical conditions. Children with disabilities were often considered cursed or possessed, and were subjected to treatments that were more likely to cause harm than provide help. Families sometimes abandoned disabled children or subjected them to religious rituals that were traumatic and dangerous. With each shift in weather without adequate food storage, heating, or protective clothing, seasonal survival was a constant struggle that claimed thousands of lives annually and left survivors weakened and diseased. Winter was the most deadly season since heating fuel was expensive, and often inadequate. Families would crowd together in small unventilated spaces, burning whatever combustible materials they could find, including animal dung, dried leaves, and sometimes toxic substances that released harmful fumes. The combination of poor ventilation and questionable fuel created indoor air pollution that caused respiratory problems and poisoning. Food scarcity during winter meant that people would eat increasingly questionable preserved foods as fresh options disappeared. Stored grain would be contaminated with mold and insects, preserved meat would be spoiled beyond recognition, and vegetables would rot in storage. But people ate these contaminated foods because the alternative was starvation. Winter diets consisted mainly of foods that were actively harmful to health. Hygiene became even worse during winter, since water would freeze, and fuel for heating water was scarce. People would go entire seasons without washing their bodies or clothing, while living in close quarters with family members and animals. The concentration of unwashed humans and animals in small heated spaces created aromatic conditions that would challenge modern sanitation workers. Disease transmission accelerated during winter, since people spent more time in close contact with each other, while their immune systems were weakened by poor nutrition and vitamin deficiencies. Respiratory diseases would sweep through communities, while other illnesses spread rapidly among people who were already compromised by cold, malnutrition, and unsanitary living conditions. Spring brought relief from winter conditions, but also created new health hazards. As snow melted, it would wash accumulated waste from throughout communities into water sources and living areas. Spring floods would carry human waste, animal carcasses, and other contamination into wells, homes, and food storage areas, creating massive pollution events that caused disease outbreaks. Food poisoning was common in spring as people consumed stored foods that had spoiled during winter storage. People would eat moldy grain, spoiled meat, and rotted vegetables because they were desperate for food. After winter shortages, the transition from preserved winter foods to fresh spring foods often caused digestive problems as people's systems adapted to dietary changes. Seasonal work exposed people to different types of contamination as activities changed with weather. Spring planting meant working in fields contaminated with winter waste. Summer harvesting exposed workers to grain dust and plant diseases. Autumn food processing created opportunities for contamination during preservation activities. Each season brought its own occupational hazards. Summer heat created new challenges. Since there was no refrigeration or effective food preservation, hot weather accelerated food spoilage. While increasing the bacterial growth in all organic material, people would consume foods that had spoiled quickly in the heat, while also dealing with increased insect activity that spread diseases and contaminated food supplies. Water sources were especially problematic during summer, since hot weather accelerated bacterial growth, while reducing water availability. Wells would become concentrated with contaminants as water levels dropped, while surface water sources would become breeding grounds for disease-causing organisms. Summer drought made people more dependent on contaminated water sources. Harvest season created massive food safety problems, since large quantities of food had to be processed and stored quickly. Without adequate preservation technology, grain would be harvested and stored while still containing insects and moisture, leading to mold growth and spoilage. Fruits and vegetables would rot during processing, while meat preservation often failed, resulting in contaminated food supplies. Trompe aberration for winter involved activities that exposed people to additional health hazards. Slaughtering animals for winter food storage created large amounts of blood and waste that attracted disease vectors, while food preservation processes often failed, leading to contaminated supplies that would be consumed during winter months when alternatives weren't available. Weather-related injuries were common since people had to work outdoors, regardless of conditions, without protective equipment or adequate clothing. Exposure to extreme weather caused frostbite, hypothermia, heat stroke, and other conditions that were often fatal. Without proper medical care, people would continue working in dangerous weather because stopping meant starvation. Seasonal migration of diseases followed weather patterns as different conditions favored different types of contamination. Warm weather brought insect-borne diseases, while cold weather created conditions for respiratory infections. People never knew what new health hazards each season might bring, had no effective methods for prevention or treatment. Agricultural cycles created periods of abundance followed by scarcity that affected health throughout the year. People would overeat during harvest time, then face malnutrition during winter shortages. This cycle of feast and famine weakened immune systems, and created conditions where seasonal diseases could spread rapidly through vulnerable populations. Seasonal clothing changes were minimal since most people owned very few garments that had to serve throughout the year. People would wear the same basic clothing in all weather, simply adding or removing layers as temperatures changed. Winter clothing was often damp from condensation, while summer clothing became saturated with sweat, creating perfect conditions for bacterial growth and skin diseases. Medieval trade routes were essentially highways for disease transmission that connected contaminated communities across vast distances, while spreading infections, germs and parasites along with goods and services. Merchants, traders, and their customers created networks of contamination that ensured diseases would spread far beyond their original sources. Concentrated sources of contamination, where goods that had traveled through multiple contaminated locations would be handled by numerous people before reaching final customers. Food products would be touched by dozens of unwashed hands, while textiles and other goods would absorb the odors and diseases of every location they had passed through. Buying anything at a medieval market meant accepting contamination from unknown sources. Currency was a vehicle for disease transmission, since coins and other forms of money would pass through countless contaminated hands, while never being cleaned or disinfected. The same coins that purchased food might have previously been handled by people with infectious diseases, creating a monetary system that spread contamination with every transaction. Traveling merchants were mobile disease vectors who would pick up infections in one location and carry them to distant communities along with their trade goods. Merchant caravans were essentially traveling plague ships that could introduce new diseases to populations that had no previous exposure or immunity to foreign infections. Storage and warehousing of goods created additional contamination opportunities since products would be kept in unsanitary conditions for extended periods before sale. Goods would be stored in buildings that also housed animals, attracted vermin and accumulated waste, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission and product contamination. International trade brought together diseases from different continents, creating opportunities for pandemic outbreaks. When populations encountered infections they had never been exposed to before, spices from Asia, textiles from the Middle East, and other exotic goods came with their own complement of foreign diseases that could devastate European populations. Craft guilds and professional organizations created concentrated sources of occupational contamination, since people working in the same trades gather together while sharing tools, materials, and workspace. Guild members would be exposed to the same toxic substances and disease risks, while also transmitting infections among themselves during professional gatherings. Apprenticeship systems exposed young people to concentrated doses of occupational hazards, since they would live and work closely with masters who had been exposed to trade-specific contamination for years. Apprentices would inherit not only professional skills but also the accumulated health problems and disease exposure that came with their chosen trades. Quality control was non-existent, so contaminated or dangerous products would be sold alongside safe ones without any way for customers to distinguish between them. People would purchase food that was spoiled, textiles that were contaminated with toxic dyes, and tools that were made with dangerous materials, while having no recourse if products caused illness or injury. Credit and debt systems created additional health hazards, since people who couldn't pay their debts would often be imprisoned in conditions that were worse than normal medieval living standards. Debtors' prisons were crowded, unsanitary facilities where people would be exposed to concentrate contamination, while being denied adequate food, water, and medical care. Shipping and transportation exposed workers to unique hazards, since they would handle goods from multiple contaminated sources while working in close quarters with other workers. Ship crews would be confined together for weeks or months while being exposed to spoiled food, contaminated water, and whatever diseases their cargo might be carrying. Advertising and promotion of goods was often misleading, since there were no truth in advertising standards. Vendors would claim health benefits for products that were actually harmful, or sell contaminated goods as premium quality items. People would pay extra for products that were supposedly pure or beneficial, while actually purchasing concentrated sources of contamination. Weights and measures were inconsistent and often fraudulent, since there were no standardized systems for ensuring accurate transactions. Customers might receive less product than they paid for, while also getting goods that were contaminated or dangerous. The lack of consumer protection meant that people had no recourse when they were cheated or harmed by defective products. Regional specialization meant that different areas developed their own signature forms of contamination that would be exported along with their products. Wool from sheep raising areas carried different diseases than grain from agricultural regions, while manufactured goods carried the specific contamination associated with their production methods. Seasonal trade patterns created predictable disease transmission cycles, as merchants would travel established routes during specific times of year, carrying infections that would arrive in different communities on schedule. People learned to expect certain diseases to appear when trade caravans arrived from specific regions. Religious communities were supposed to represent purity and spiritual cleanliness, but medieval clergy lived in conditions that were often more contaminated than secular society. Monasteries, convents, and other religious institutions created concentrated sources of disease transmission, while preaching about the spiritual benefits of suffering and the dangers of worldly cleanliness. Monastic communities practiced deliberate physical mortification that caused injuries, infections, and diseases. As expressions of religious devotion, monks and nuns would deliberately harm themselves through flagellation, wearing hair shirts, sleeping on hard surfaces, and other practices that compromised their health while believing these sufferings brought them closer to God. Communal living in religious institutions meant that diseases would spread rapidly through entire communities of clergy. Dormitories, dining halls, and worship spaces were shared by dozens or hundreds of people who lived in close quarters while following dietary and hygiene practices that weakened their immune systems. Fasting and dietary restrictions weakened religious communities' ability to resist disease, since inadequate nutrition compromised immune systems while creating conditions for malnutrition-related illnesses. Clergy would deliberately avoid nutritious foods as expressions of spiritual discipline, while consuming minimal calories that left them vulnerable to infections and other health problems. Celibacy requirements created additional health hazards. Since religious communities had no legitimate outlets for sexual expression, this led to secretive sexual behavior that often involved prostitution, homosexual relationships, or abuse that carried risks of sexually transmitted diseases, while also created psychological trauma and social dysfunction. Pilgrimage routes were highways for disease transmission that connected religious sites across vast distances while spreading contamination between different populations. Pilgrims would travel long distances while living in unsanitary conditions, sharing accommodations with strangers, and visiting religious sites that attracted people from wide geographic areas. Religious ceremonies often involved practices that spread disease among participants. Communion involved sharing cups and food among large groups of people, while other rituals required physical contact between clergy and congregations. Religious festivals brought together thousands of people in close quarters, while encouraging behaviors that maximized disease transmission. Holy relics were often contaminated body parts or objects that had been exposed to disease but were venerated by people who believed they had miraculous healing powers. Pilgrims would kiss, touch, and pray over decomposing remains, while believing they were receiving spiritual benefits but actually exposing themselves to various infections. Manuscript copying and scholarly work exposed clergy to specific health hazards, since they would work in poorly ventilated scriptoriums while being exposed to toxic inks and parchment preparation materials. Religious scholars often developed respiratory problems and other health issues from constant exposure to chemical fumes and poor working conditions. Charitable work brought clergy into contact with the sickest and most contaminated members of society, while providing them with no protective equipment or medical knowledge. Religious communities would care for plague victims, lepers, and other highly contagious patients, while having no understanding of disease transmission or prevention. Confession and spiritual counseling required close physical proximity between clergy and people who might be carrying infectious diseases. Priests would spend hours in small enclosed spaces with penitents while breathing contaminated air, and sometimes handling objects that had been touched by infected people. Religious education and recruitment often targeted young people who were especially vulnerable to the health hazards of religious life. Children would be sent to monasteries and convents where they would be exposed to the concentrated contamination and deliberate suffering that characterized religious communities. Healing ministries attempted to treat diseases through prayer and religious ritual rather than medical intervention. Clergy would attempt to cure illnesses through spiritual means, while often making conditions worse through their interventions. Religious healing often prevented people from seeking effective medical treatment. Missionary work exposed clergy to diseases from different geographic regions, while also spreading European diseases to populations that had no previous exposure or immunity. Missionaries would travel to foreign lands while carrying their own complement of diseases and picking up new infections that they would bring back to their home communities. Church construction and maintenance exposed religious workers to specific occupational hazards, while creating buildings that often had poor ventilation and sanitation systems. Religious architecture prioritized spiritual symbolism over practical health considerations, creating beautiful buildings that were also breeding grounds for disease. So there you have it, the Dark Ages in all their aromatic glory, a time when personal hygiene was considered spiritually dangerous, when drinking water was more toxic than alcohol, when medical treatment was more likely to kill you than cure you, and when the very act of living was essentially a prolonged exercise in biological Russian roulette. These weren't just different times with different standards. These were centuries when basic understanding of health, disease and sanitation was so backwards that normal daily activities were essentially slow-motion suicide missions. Yet somehow humanity survived these conditions and eventually developed the knowledge and technology that allows us to live in relative cleanliness and safety today. The next time you complain about having to wash your hands or wear a mask or follow basic hygiene guidelines, just remember that your ancestors would have considered these simple precautions to be miraculous interventions that could prevent diseases and suffering beyond their wildest imagination. We live in an age of unprecedented cleanliness and health, largely because we learned from the mistakes and horrors of our medieval predecessors. And with that aromatic journey through history complete, perhaps you can drift off to sleep, grateful for modern plumbing soap, antibiotics, and the basic understanding that washing occasionally might actually be good for you. Sweet dreams, and remember, in the grand scheme of human history, you're living in the cleanest, healthiest time our species has ever experienced, even on your worst day.